Hello, my name is Jay McFarland. Once again, we are joined by Mike Steinberg, CEO and founder of Hedgestone. Mike, I get kind of nervous when I think about the concept of the buyer and the seller first meeting and how that's going to go. Are they going to get along? What type of negotiations are going to be there? I'm guessing you have to really kind of know ahead of time what types of questions they're going to ask and be ready to answer those questions.
Of course, you really want to get prepared before that meeting. You got to prep the seller as the broker, and you got to prep the buyer. There's things that you do during the meeting, and then there's things that you don't do. You never want the buyer and the seller to talk directly about the price when they're together with you. You always want to, if someone talks about the price and tries to make a deal on the spot, you always want to say, Mr. Seller, we'll talk. You interrupt and you say, Mr. Seller, let's talk about the price separately. Mr. Buyer, let's talk about the price separately. It's very important. You have to control the situation. And of course, there's other questions as well that you should be prepared for.
Yeah. So if I'm not talking about price, give me an idea of what kind of questions you are asking and answering as the buyer and seller meet each other.
So the buyer is going to really want to know why the seller is selling. That's like one of the most important questions. Is it because he's losing money, or is it because, he's retiring? So the motivation of the sale is very important. The buyer is also going to ask, who are his competitors? Who's the closest car wash? Who's the closest bagel store? So you should really, before the meeting, you should educate the buyer on the nearest competition. The buyer's also going to want to know how does the seller spend his time? Is the seller in the business working every day? Is the seller working on the business remotely? Where is the seller during, when the business is happening? The buyer's going to ask about how many employees there are, full-time and part-time, what the roles of the employees are, who the managers are, how much the managers get paid, how long the employees and managers have been at the company. They're going to ask all about the people. They're going to ask, how long has the business been marketed? How long have you had the listing for? They're going to want to know why it's taking 6 months to sell this business. And they're also going to want to know how ready is the seller? Is he ready to close now? Is he ready to close in 6 months? All these questions are going to come to the buyer's mind. And, what the seller is going to ask you is, what am I going to do, Mike? I want to sell. Sometimes this happens. But what am I going to do after the sale? Could you get me into another business? Could you pivot me into another direction? And as a very strategic business broker, you should be able to work both sides of the equation.
Yeah. I'm just curious, have you had a situation where you get the buyer and seller together and you can tell their personalities clash or their interests clash, and you have to find a way to manage that?
Oh, of course, not everyone's going to be best friends. And even if they're not best friends, deals still can get done, because sometimes these buyers and sellers take their emotions out of it. They look at the numbers, and if they don't like each other, the numbers still match. There's going to be a hard negotiation, but they'll still eventually transact. So as the broker, you're their psychologist as well. You got to remember that. They call me the business doctor. I'm just kidding, but it's important to really be close to both parties and intervene when you have to.
Yeah, maybe not a doctor, maybe that's not the best term, but I think translator, because you find people who, although they're both speaking English, they're not syncing up. Sometimes I see in negotiations where both sides are saying the same thing, but it's sounding as something different to the other side. So you're the guy in the middle going, no, that's exactly what he's saying, or helping them understand the language of the other side.
Or taking the blame. If something they said was wrong, sometimes I have to, even though I'm the good guy, I have to say I'm the bad guy to protect the buyer against the seller. So as you do more deals, you'll learn. I've done about 500 deals, so I have a lot of experience with dealing with people. And another very important thing is to have all the numbers ready. You want to have the bank statements, you want to have the tax returns, you want to have all the POS records. Everything has to be ready because after that meeting, the buyer says he's interested. You should be able to send them information right away.
Yeah, so the first part of the conversation, they're getting to know each other, motivations, those types of things. But where the rubber really meets the road is in that documentation. That's where you're going to prove that everything is where you said it would be.
Yes, and that's why I like to have everything, all the documentation before. So I, as the broker, can really dig into the numbers. And when I send those numbers to the buyer, I have full confidence. And also, I want to talk to the seller and prep the seller as well. It's very important to really prepare the seller on what to say to the buyer.
When you talk about preparing the seller, what types of things are you preparing them for? Is there an emotional element to that? What are some of your suggestions for the seller?
I always tell the seller, be a better listener than a talker. It's important for them to know why you're selling, but don't overtalk and try to oversell because it's really the buyer is the one who's putting the money up. So you really have to answer his questions and what he's asking rather than showing that you're a big shot and look at my business. So it's business. Take the emotions out of it. Talk about your numbers. Talk about why you're selling. Talk about your employees, your key managers, and I prepped them on that information.
And you've prepped them on that information because you've done your homework and you have a better understanding perhaps than either side about the numbers, the motivation, and all of those kind of things.
Correct. And I also, I tell them to introduce their company and explain the roots and, and the history of their company as well. And I like the buyer to know that of why the owner is selling and how long he's owned the company. That's important.
How do you know? Are there some signs that you walk out and you're like high-fiving? You're like, yeah, that was a great meeting. How do you know? How do you gauge that?
When everything adds up, when everything's consistent, consistency is extremely important. So if I told the buyer that the business is making $100,000 a month and the buyer comes in and the seller says he's making $110,000 a month, it's a great sign, So that's why I always under-promise and over-deliver.
Yeah. And I think they're gonna sync up because you've spent so much time making sure they're gonna sync up. That's all part of the planning and preparation process.
Absolutely. If you don't do that, you're just shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, and you don't know what's gonna happen. So you're not managing expectations, right?
Yeah, you got to control the situation.
So we've had the meeting. The meeting went great. What happens next? What's the follow-up?
So the follow-up is you want to schedule a following meeting. But before you want to do that, you want to answer all the buyer's questions as quickly and as efficiently as possible. You want to gather all of the requested documents for that buyer, which I already have before, and you want to send them. You don't want to send them everything. You want to send them what they asked for. You don't want to send them give away the farm right away. If someone's only asking for POS reports, I'm not going to send them tax returns and bank statements. I'm going to send them POS reports. Then when they ask for the tax returns, I have it right away. I'll send it to them. So all this is what you learn during the experience, but I'm happy to share it with everyone.
Well, I love that you're sharing it. It's just a great tip. I can see a business broker just sending over every piece of documentation, and perhaps there's something there that might spoil the deal, or they're just overwhelmed by everything. What did you say?
Yeah. Or they're overwhelmed and, they have so many questions. Your goal from that meeting, my goal after they meet is to get an LOI right away. It's to put this deal to bed. How am I going to get an accepted offer, a letter of intent from the buyer, and a little deposit as well so I could take it off the market?
Yeah, and so that's how you know that meeting went really well. You've met with them, you did your high fives. Now you've sent over any documents they've requested, and now you've got a letter of intent. I am just curious, once you've had that letter of intent, Is it I'm guessing is a pretty good success rate that you'll close after you get the LOI?
Honestly, unless you have a lot of experience, it's a 50-50 shot.
Really? So
I know
even
it's surprising, but you got to really, on the letter of intent, you got to strategically outline the due diligence. The due diligence is everything. That's how we close deals at Headstone. We make sure that our due diligence is crisp, because if we don't have that documentation, if we don't know our numbers, it's a 20% chance that we'll close after an LOI. 50 is very high, and I'm being, and that's because we really have our stuff together.
That really surprises me, but I'm glad that you're sharing that information. Are there things that you do to make sure, and you've talked about being crisp. I guess my question is more about if it does follow through, what's the time frame from getting that LOI to closing the deal once you've crossed that threshold?
The time frame usually, after they sign an LOI, I would like to get it into contract within 10 days. So once it's in contract, then it's 90% closed. Once it's in contract, we can cool off. We can be like, okay, this deal is 90% closed. They have 10% of the gross sales price in an escrow account with the other attorney. So they have a lot of skin in the game. And then you can go on to the next deal.
So the goal is to go from the meeting where they meet and you've prepared them, then send them necessary documents, get them in an LOI, and then I'm thinking the high five really comes after the contract gets signed, not after any of the other steps we've talked about.
I think the high five does, but for me, the high five comes when we get the check and it clears.
Yeah, that's the most important part of the equation. That's why you're in this for sure. Well, once again, great discussion, Mike, about preparing for that first meeting and what are the steps afterwards. Thank you for sharing your insights and your little pieces of wisdom. I think that they will go a long way in helping people out who are watching. So thanks again for your time and experience.
Thank you, Jay. Appreciate it.